Welcome to the Archive of Nations, home of the custodians of the sacred records from time immemorial. Please subscribe and press the notification button as we have many lessons to educate and empower with a correct narrative of the past to create a lawful blueprint for the future. The Archive of Nations continues the narrative of the carbon organics families, tribes, and clans in this webisode entitled George Wells Parker's 1917 Speech on Black Greece. We will first begin discussing the early 1900s, which saw an explosion of supporters for the African substratum theory first put forward by Giuseppe Sergi and published in 1901 and 1936, also by Morris published in 1900, and Pokorny's article which was published between 1927 and 1930. During this early period, it looked as if the African substratum theory was winning. The tide began to reverse from the 1930s onward with the rise of fascism across Europe. Educational institutions were encouraged to promote the Aryan theory, and as a result, the African substratum theory was slowly being replaced with the racist fabricated Aryan Indo-European model. The Harvard publication The Races of Europe was an attempt to replace the theories put forward by Giuseppe Sergi. Giuseppe Sergi was an Italian anthropologist of the early 20th century, best known for his opposition to Nordicism in his books on the racial identity of Mediterranean peoples. In 1880, he was appointed as professor of anthropology at the University of Bologna. At this time, the discipline of anthropology was still associated with the literature faculty. In the following years, thanks to the activity of his laboratory of anthropology and psychology, he helped establish the discipline on a more scientific basis. In 1884, he moved to the University of Rome, where he developed a program of research into both anthropology and psychology. Internationally renowned for his contributions to anthropology, he also succeeded in establishing the International Conference of Psychology in Rome, 1905, under his presidency of the society. He died at Rome in 1936. His son Sergio Sergi, 1878 to 1972, also a noted anthropologist, developed his father's theories. He rejected existing racial typologies that identified Mediterranean peoples as dark whites because they implied a Nordicist conception of Mediterranean peoples descending from whites who had become racially mixed with non-whites, which he claimed was false. He claimed that the Nordic race was descended from the Mediterranean race whose skin had depigmented to a pale complexion after it moved north. This concept became important to the modeling of racial difference in the early 20th century. Sergi's major theoretical achievement was his model of human ancestry, fully articulated in his books Human Variation and the Mediterranean Race, 1901. In which he argued that the earliest European peoples arose from original populations in the Horn of Africa and were related to Hamitic peoples. This primal Eurafrican race split into three main groups: the Hamites, the Mediterranean race, and the North European Nordic race. Semitic people were closely related to Mediterraneans, but constituted a distinct Afro-Asian group. The four great branches of the Mediterranean stock were the Libyans or Berbers, the Ligurians, the Pelasgians, and the Iberians. Ancient Egyptians were considered by Sergi as a branch of the Hamitic race. According to Sergi, the Mediterranean race, the greatest race in the world, was responsible for the great civilizations of ancient times, including those of Egypt, Carthage, Greece, and Rome. These Mediterranean peoples were quite distinct from the peoples of Northern Europe. Sergi argued that the Mediterraneans were more creative and imaginative than other peoples, which explained their ancient cultural and intellectual achievements, but that they were by nature volatile and unstable. In his book The Decline of the Latin Nations, he argued that Northern Europeans had developed stoicism, tenacity, and self-discipline due to the cold climate, and so were better adapted to succeed in modern civic cultures and economies. These theories were developed in opposition to Nordicism, the claim that the Nordic race was of pure Aryan stock and naturally superior to other Europeans. Sergi ridiculed Nordicists who claimed that the leaders of ancient Greek and Roman civilization were Germanic in origin and argued that the Germanic invasions at the end of the Roman Empire had produced delinquency, vagabondage, and ferocity. Sergi believed that the Aryans were originally Eurasiatic barbarians who migrated from the Hindu Kush into Europe. He argued that the Italians had originally spoken a Hamitic language until the Aryan, Indo-European, Italic language spread across the country. Some Aryan influence was detectable in northern Italy, But, racially speaking, Italians were unaffected by Aryan migrants. Sergi expanded on those theories in later publications. Despite his denigration of Aryans and emphasis on Mediterranean racial identity, he denied that he was motivated by national pride, asserting that his works had the goal of establishing the veracity of the facts without racial prejudice, without diminishing the value of one human type in order to exalt another one. His last book, The Britons, 1936, sought to trace the rise of the British Empire to the Mediterranean component of the British population. The Eurafrican, or Afro-Mediterranean theory, proposed by Sergi held the belief that dark-skinned, long-haired humans migrated from Africa and populated ancient Europe. Sergi attributed the founding of Greece, Egypt, and other civilizations to these Eurafricans. He was deeply opposed to the Aryan lie, as for Sergi the so-called Aryans were uncivilized and did not contribute to ancient Greece. Sergi believed that the original Neolithic settlers were from Africa with dark skin. A change in skin color occurred very recently in Europe during the Bronze Age 3000 BC to 1000 BCE, as discussed in our previous webisodes. These migrants from the Russian steppes known today as the Amnea introduced genes responsible for the lightest skin color. The key pigmentation genes in humans are SLC24A5. These skin color changes were not due to evolutionary processes, as dark-skinned Mesolithic and Neolithic populations inhabited Europe for thousands of years. The Atlantic fringe countries were the last to undergo skin color changes, and this would have started circa 1000 BCE. The concept of race did not exist in the ancient world. It is a recent social construct. The recent development of DNA analysis has led some people to suggest that humans can be divided into genetic populations. However, the cultural background of the investigator can influence data interpretation. The question proposed is, when is sub-Saharan DNA, not sub-Saharan DNA? And the answer is when it is found in Europe. The E1b11v1y DNA haplogroup in males originate in East Africa, where it's classified as sub-Saharan. However, when it appears in Greece and in the Balkans in the form of E1b1EV1.3, it miraculously no longer qualifies to be sub-Saharan by Eurocentric scientists. As soon as African haplogroups leave Africa through human migrations and then return back to Africa, it is strangely labeled by Eurocentric as Eurasian bag migration. The term Eurafrican or Afro-Mediterranean was developed by Sergi, the father of European anthropology, to describe prehistoric groups of dark-skinned people that migrated from Africa into Europe. He credits these people with the founding of all civilizations in the Mediterranean Greece, including Italy, Crete, Egypt, etc. George Wells Parker was born September 18, 1882, and joined the Ancestors in July 28, 1931. He was an African-American political activist, historian, public intellectual, and writer who co-founded the Hamitic League of the World. The Hamitic League of the World was an African-American nationalist organization. Its declared aims were to inspire the Negro with new hopes, to make him openly proud of his race and of its great contributions to the religious development and civilization of mankind, and to place in the hands of every race, man and woman and child, the facts which support the League's claim that the Negro race is the greatest race the world has ever known. George Wells Parker's speech is still a classic. It was delivered to the Omaha Philosophical Society on April 1st, 1917, and published in the Journal of Negro History, Volume 2, 1917, and it reads as thus.
Ladies and gentlemen, that when you first read the subject of the address to be delivered before this society today, you were a bit surprised, and, I trust, a bit interested. To claim an African origin for the Grecian civilization is hardly in keeping with the historical traditions inherited from our school days. It savors of a sort of heresy and passes far beyond the limits of popular opinion. There is a peculiar unanimity among all historians to state without reservation that the greatest civilization the world has ever known was preeminently Aryan, but historians are not always to be relied upon. They write for their own race and times and are careful to give as little credit as possible to races and events which fall within the pale of their prejudices. I question, however, if there is to be gained any ultimate good by subverting truth and popularizing error. Indeed, I believe that if today our historians, authors, press, and pulpit would give the public the truth as far as it is possible to attain it, tomorrow would find us filled with a new vigor and a fresh determination to conquer the wrongs and inconsistencies of human life. The old idea of the Grecian civilization was that it sprung, like Minerva, full-armed from the brow of Zeus. It seemed to have no tangible beginning. The fabled kings and heroes of the Homeric age, with their palaces and strongholds, were said to have been humanized sun myths, their deeds but songs woven by wandering minstrels to win their meat of bread. Yet there has always been a suspicion among scholars that this view was wrong. The more we study the moral aspects of humanity, the more we become convinced that the flower and fruit of civilization are evolved according to laws as immutable as those laws governing the manifestations of physical life. Historians have written that Aryans invaded Greece about 1400 BC, and that henceforth arose the wonderful civilization, but the student knows that such was impossibility and that some vital factor has been left out of the equation. When the Aryans invaded Greece, they were savages from Neolithic Europe and could not possibly have possessed the high artistic capacities and rich culture necessary for the unfolding of Aegean civilization. Of thorns men do not gather figs, nor of a bramble bush gather they grapes. Speaking of the two foremost Grecian states, Herodotus writes as follows: "These are the Lacedaemonians and Athenians, the former of Doric, the latter of Ionic blood." And, indeed, these two nations had held from very early times the most distinguished place in Greece, the one being Pelasgic, the other a Hellenic people, and the one having never quitted its original seas, while the other had been excessively migratory. The Hellenes, wrote Professor Boughton in the Arena some years ago, were the Aryans first to be brought into contact with these sunburned Hamites, who, let it be remembered, though classed as whites, were probably as strongly Nigritic as are the Afro-Americans. We derived from the Pelasgians, who, being blood relations of the Egyptians, undoubtedly brought the knowledge from Egypt. The aptitude for art among all nations of antiquity, remarked Count de Gobineau a few years later, was derived from an amalgamation with black races. The Egyptians, Assyrians, and Etruscans were nothing but half-breeds, mulattoes. In the year 1884, Alexander Winchell, the famous American geologist, upset Americans with an article appearing in the North American Review. From it I quote the following: "The Pelasgic Empire was at its meridian as early as 2500 BC. This people came from the islands of the Aegean, and more remotely from Asia Minor. They were originally a branch of the sunburned Hamitic stock that laid the basis of civilization in Canaan and Mesopotamia, destined later to be Semitized. Danaus and his daughters, that is, the fugitive shepherds from Egypt, sought refuge among their Hamitic kindred in the Peloponnesus about 1700 BC. 300 years before this, these Pelasgians had learned the art of weaving from Aryan immigrants. In time, they occupied the whole of Greece and Thessaly. Before 200 BC, they established themselves in Italy. Thus do we get a conception of a vast Hamitic empire existing in prehistoric times, whose several nationalities were centered in Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, northwestern Africa, Iberia, Greece, Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Central Europe, an intellectual ethnic family, the first of the Edomites to emerge into historic light, but with the records of its achievements buried in gloom almost as dense as that which covers the ruder populations that the Hamites everywhere displaced. To this family, chiefly, are to be traced the dark complexions of the nations and tribes still dwelling around the shores of the Mediterranean. It was to be expected that such statements as the foregoing would throw the scholastic world into a ferment. There was a scramble to bolster up the cause of Aryanism and to preserve this one civilization, at least, to the credit of the Caucasian race. Homer was scanned with patience unknown to college students, and the classic myths were refined in the alembics of masterminds. Yet there were some who cared for truth more than for racial glory, and among them was Dr. Schliemann. Armed with a spade, he went to the classic lands and brought to light a real Troy. At Tiryns and Mycenae, he laid to view the palaces and tombs and treasures of Homeric kings. His message back to scholars who waited tensely for his verdict was, "It looks to me like the civilization of an African people." A new world opened to archaeologists, and the Aegean became the Mecca of the world. Traces of this prehistoric civilization began to make their appearance far beyond the limits of Greece itself. From Cyprus and Palestine to Sicily and southern Italy, and even to the coasts of Spain, the colonial and industrial enterprise of the Mycenaeans has left its mark throughout the Mediterranean basin. The heretics were vindicated. Whether they like it or not, Declared Sir Arthur Evans before the London Hellenic Society a short time ago, classical students must consider origins. The Grecians whom we discern in the New Dawn were not the pale-skinned northerners, but essentially the dark-haired, brown-complexioned race. Perhaps Sir Arthur's words will carry weight with you when I remark that his wonderful discoveries in classical lands have brought him the honor of election last year as president of the British Association, the most notable assemblage of scholars in the world. I might further mention that Professor Sergei of the University of Rome has founded a new study of the origin of European civilization upon the remarkable archaeological finds entitled The Mediterranean Race. From this masterly work I choose the following. Until recent years, the Greeks and Romans were regarded as Aryans, and then as Aryanized peoples. The great discoveries in the Mediterranean have overturned all these views. Today, although a few belated supporters of Aryanism still remain, it is becoming clear that the most ancient civilization of the Mediterranean is not of Aryan origin. The Aryans were savages when they invaded Europe. They destroyed in part the superior civilization of the Neolithic populations and could not have created the Greco-Latin civilization. The primitive populations of Europe originated in Africa, and the basin of the Mediterranean was the chief center of movement when the African migrations reached the center and north of Europe. What, then, are some of those discoveries which have so completely destroyed the ethnic fetish of the Caucasian race? The greatest and most conclusive of them all was the discovery of the Palace of Minos by Sir Arthur Evans. In 1894, this scientist undertook a series of exploration campaigns in central and eastern Crete. It has so happened that some years previous he had been hunting out ancient engraved stones at Athens and came upon some 3- or 4-sided seals showing on each of their faces groups of hieroglyphics and linear signs distinct from the Egyptian and Hittite, but evidently representing some form of script. Upon inquiry, Sir Arthur learned that these seals had been found in Crete, and to Crete he went. The legends of the famous labyrinth and palace of Minos came back to him and were refreshed by the gossipy peasants, who repeated the tales that had come down as ancestral memories. In wandering around the site of his proposed labors, Sir Arthur noticed some ruined walls, the great gypsum blocks of which were engraved with curious symbolic characters, crowning the southern slope of a hill known as Kephala, overlooking the ancient site of Knossos, the city of Minos. It was the prelude to the discovery of the ruins of a palace, the most wonderful archaeological find of modern times. I will not have time today to review the mass of archaeological data which the discoveries of this civilization have produced. They consist of cyclopean ruins of cities and strongholds, tombs, vases, statues, votive bronzes, and exquisitely engraved gems and intaglios. That which is most valuable in establishing the claim of the African origin of the Grecian civilization is the discovery of the frescoes on the palace walls. These opened up a new epoch in painting and are of the utmost interest to the world. The colors are almost as brilliant as when laid down more than 3,000 years ago. Among these frescoes are numerous representations of the race whose civilization they represent. It was a race neither Aryan nor Semitic, but African. The portraitures follow the Egyptian precedent, and for the first time the mysterious Minoan and Mycenaean people rise before us. The tint of the flesh is of a deep reddish brown and the limbs finely molded. The profile of the face is pure and almost classically Greek. The hair is black and curling and the lips somewhat full, giving the entire physiognomy a distinct African cast. In the women's quarters, the frescoes show them to be much fairer, the difference in complexion being due, probably, to the seclusion of harem life. But in their countenances, too, remain those distinguishable features which link with the African race. You will pardon me, I trust, if occasion is taken here to impress upon you the value of genuine archaeological evidence. Historians may write anything to reflect their vanity or their prejudices, but when the remains of ancient civilizations rise out of the dust and sands and give the lie to their assertions, there is nothing more to be said. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, Greece, and Rome have all been claimed for the Aryan, but the spade is unearthed stone that bears sentient witness to the fact that Africa has been the pioneer in the field of civilization. We wonder, then, why the historians continue to ignore these remains and persist in continuing falsehood. There can be but one answer, and that is racial vanity prefers falsehood to truth and prejudice demands suppression rather than expression. Yet these frescoes of Crete need not be such a surprise to scholars and public after all. The very classics themselves have more than hinted of the great part played by Africa in the development of Grecian civilization. Let us revert to the myths and trace the descent of Minos and his progeny. You will recollect that the ancient heroes of Greece were divided into the older and younger branches, the former belonging to the house of Inachus, distinctly Hamitic, while the latter belonged to the race of Japotus, distinctly a mixture. The Pelasgic races of the south traced their descent from Inachus, the river god and son of Oceanus. The son of Inachus, Pharanius, lived in the Peloponnesus and founded the town of Argos. His son, Pelasgus, from whom the aforementioned races of the south derived their name, succeeded him. Io, the divine sister of Pharanius, had the good fortune, or perhaps misfortune, to attract the attention of the all-loving Zeus and as a consequence incurred the enmity of Hera. Zeus transforms her into a beautiful heifer, but a gadfly set by Hera torments her until she is driven mad and starts upon those famous wanderings, which became the subject of many of the most celebrated stories of antiquity. Aeschylus reviews her roamings in his great tragedy, Prometheus Bound, and makes Io to arrive at Mount Caucasus, to which the Firebringer is chained. It is here that Prometheus delivers to her the oracle given him by his mother, Themis, Titan-born. He directs her to Conobos, a city on the Nile, and tells her that there Zeus will restore her mind. And thou shalt bear a child of Zeus begotten, Epiphos, touchborn, swarthy of hue. Aryan parents do not usually bear black children, and to show that Aeschylus was thoroughly cognizant of the ethnical relationship here implied, permit me to quote from The Suppliants, another of his tragedies. The suppliants were the 50 daughters of Danaus, the shepherds of Egypt, and they described themselves as, "We, of swart sunburnt race, our race that sprang from Epiphos," and when they appear before the Argive king, claiming his country as their ancestral home, their color causes him to question their claims in the following words. "Nay, stranger, what ye tell is past belief. For me to hear that ye from Argos spring, for ye to Libyan women are most like, and no wise to our native maidens here. Such race might Nilus breed, and Cyprian mold. Like yours, is stamped by skilled artificers on women's features, and I hear that those of India travel upon camels born, swift as the horse, yet trained as sumpter mules, e'en those who as the Ethiops' neighbors dwell. And had ye borne the bow, I should have guessed, undoubting, ye were of the Amazon tribe." No, Aeschylus made no mistake. He meant just what he wrote, and the discoveries of the wonderful Minoan civilization have proven that the swarthy touchborn son of Zeus and Io was the incarnation of the African element that raised Greece to the very pinnacle of civilization. Minos is in direct descent from Epiphos, and from the latter's prolific progeny we note such names as Agenor, Cadmus, Europa, Aegyptus, Danaus, Perseus, Menelaus, husband of the famous Helen, Hercules, and Agamemnon, chosen by the Greeks to lead them against Troy. If I should conclude at this point, my thesis would be complete and conclusive, but there are other subjects which demand some attention. I cannot pass in silence the supposed testimony to the presence of the fair type in Greece and to its superiority over the darker population furnished by the Homeric poems. This supposed testimony has precipitated wordy wars as terrible, though perhaps less sanguinary, as those which were engaged in by the gods and heroes themselves. The fault, however, lies with the translators rather than with the epics. From the work of these industrious authors, we get the idea that golden hair and blue eyes were so common that there was little chance of any other sort of people lingering around. The truth of the matter is that these translators, like historians, have permitted their prejudices to warp their accuracy. There is not in the entire writings of Homer an adjective or description applying to any of the principles that even suggests a single one of them having blue eyes and golden hair, so you see that even our translators are not to be trusted. Professor Sergei made an extensive investigation of the supposed testimony to the presence of the fair type in Greece, and his conclusions are as follows. In Homer, none of the individuals are fair in the ethnographic sense of the word. I could bring forth a wealth of facts to show that what I have just stated regarding the anthropological characters of the Homeric gods and heroes may also be said, and with more reason, of the types of Greek and Roman statuary which, though in the case of the divinities they may be conventionalized, do not in the slightest degree recall the features of a northern race. Hence the blue-eyed and golden-haired gods and goddesses who grace the canvases of our art galleries and theater curtains are but pigmentary creations from the minds of artists who visualize the peculiarities of their own race, just as the Jewish Madonna is depicted as a Spanish, Dutch, German, English, Italian, Russian, Scandinavian, and even as an African mother by the different nationalities in turn. Another idea, which seems to be rapidly taking hold upon the scholastic mind, is that the Iliad and Odyssey are in reality Minoan epics made over, if you please, to fit the later Grecian epics. While the Homer we know professedly commemorates the deeds of Achaean heroes, everything about them is non-Hellenic. The whole picture of the civilization, including home life, dress, religious worship, and architecture, is Minoan and Mycenaean. Warriors' weapons are of bronze when the age to which we attribute Homer was an Iron Age. The combatants use huge body shields when, as a matter of fact, such shields had been obsolete long previous to 1200 BC. The form of worship, hymns, and invocations to deities, and the use of certain sacrificial forms were all adaptations from the Mycenaean ritual. In Homer, and the artistic representations upon the shield of Achilles and upon the shield of Hercules, as described by Hesiod, have been duplicated among the ruins of Crete. Permit me now, ladies and gentlemen, to show definitely the debt which Greece owes to the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations. Crete, as I have said before, appears to be the center from which the Mediterranean culture radiated. It is the mid-sea land, a kind of halfway house between three continents, and its geographical position makes it the logical cradle of European civilization. It is near the mainland of Greece, opposite the mouths of the Nile, and in easy communication with Asia Minor, with which it was actually connected in late geological times. As I mentioned before, the civilization expanded in every direction, and at the time of the conquest it had firm hold upon Greece, appearing at Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, Orchomenos, and other places. That some vanguard of Aryan immigrants came into contact with this culture at its climax is plain from the evidence furnished by Homer. That they mingled with the inhabitants is certain. The later onrush about 1200 BC destroyed in part the civilization found there, but fortunately there was not utter destruction. These rude people realized the difference between their savagery and their enemy's culture. They, too, merged with the inhabitants and formed the Grecian people of historic times. This amalgamation is clearly apparent in the Greeks today, and because of it Count de Gobineau has called their ancestors half-breeds and mulattoes. Note, also, if you will, that Greek genius burned brightest in those parts of Greece where the Minoan elements were most thoroughly planted. If you should inquire the source of the Minoan civilization, I would first call your attention to the fact that Herodotus attributed much of the Grecian civilization to Egypt, and secondly to the opinion expressed by Sir Arthur Evans in his presidential address before the British Association last fall. My own recent investigations, said he, have more and more brought home to me the all-pervading community between Minoan Crete and the land of pharaohs. When we realize the great indebtedness of the succeeding classical culture of Greece to its Minoan predecessor, the full significance of this conclusion will be understood. Ancient Egypt itself can no longer be regarded as something apart from general human history. Its influences are seen to lie about the very cradle of our civilization. The first quickening impulse came to Crete from the Egyptian and not from the Oriental side. Herodotus has been called the father of lies, but at this late date we again see him vindicated in a conclusion reached by the greatest living authority upon classical archaeology. Before closing, I wish again to enforce the fact that the ferment creating the wonderful Grecian civilization was preeminently the ferment of African blood. Take all the archaeological facts of the last 50 years and read them up or down, across or diagonally, inside and out, and this fact rises into your mind like a banquo that will not down. Historians may distort truth and rob the African race of its historical position, but facts are everywhere, throwing open the secret closets of nations and exposing ethnic skeletons that laugh and jest at our racial vanities. The Aryan savages of Europe came down upon Greece, found there a great civilization, merged with the inhabitants and builded a greater. The all but savage European of the Dark Ages knew nothing of culture save what had been taught him by the Roman legions, the heirs of the Mediterranean civilization. This little was almost forgotten until religious fanaticism started the Crusades and brought them into contact with the civilized refinement of the Arabians, Moors, and Saracens, likewise peoples in whose veins flowed the fiery ferment of African blood. If, as Sir Arthur Evans declares, classical students must consider origins and admit the ancient Grecians of African descent, so must they go a bit further and admit the Renaissance to have sprung because of contact between feudal Europe and African Mohammedanism. Again, we must admit, no matter how bitter the taste, that the mixed race has always been the great race, the pure race always the stagnant race. One potent reason for the possible downfall of European civilization today is the fact that the Aryan element has proven incapable of the mighty trust. It has forgotten the everlasting lesson of history that emergence of distinct types means the perpetuation of nationalism. The sole tenet of Europe has been the domination of the world by the Caucasian, and suddenly it discovers that the term Caucasian is too narrow to include both Saxon and Teuton. Hence a war for the extermination of both. The end of the world is not near, and the dream of a millennium is equidistant. The sum of all that is past is but a prelude of that which is to come. It has taken the brute a myriad of years for his gaze to reach beyond them. Civilization is a mixture of dictions and contradictions, and none of us today is sure that we know just what it means. Through all there yet remain, I close with the hope of a time when earthly values will be measured with a justice now deemed divine. It is then that Africa and her sun-brown children will be saluted. And that day men will gladly listen with open minds when she tells how in the deep and dark prehistoric night she made a stairway of the stars so that she might climb and light her torch from the altar fires of heaven, and how she has held its blaze aloft in the hall of ages to brighten the wavering footsteps of earthly nations.
George was born to Abraham W. Parker, 1856 to 1916, and his wife out of state in 1882. When he was young, his family moved to the near North Side, where his father worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. Parker started writing as a young man and won a competition at the Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition in Omaha in 1898. Competing in the Expo's national competition for high school and college writers, Parker was lauded for the style and argument in his debate paper. He was the winner of the entire event. Even from this young age, Parker's history writing focused on Africa as the cradle of civilization and promoted Africans as the greatest of all races in the world. In 1917, George Wells Park founded the Hamitic League of the World, an Afrocentric community-building organization. Based on Parker's historical analysis, the League's name was based on Ham, the son of Noah in the Old Testament of the Bible. In 1918, the Hamitic League started publishing a journal called The Crusader. In 1918, the Hamitic League published an important pamphlet written by Parker called Children of the Sun, referred to more recently as a racial vindicationalist. Parker's most popular work was said to objectively blend propaganda and scholarship. In Children of the Sun, George Wells Parker offered a short analysis of the history of the African continent, Black culture, and its broad influences throughout the entire world. He promoted archaeology and evidence that African academics and cultures were more advanced in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, and laid out a compelling argument to reestablish the entire historical canon to reflect this reality. Then, Parker highlighted the relationship between African Americans and the Ku Klux Klan. He hammered on the need for Black people to pay attention to the Klan by emphasizing the damning effects of the organization. He drove into the issue by saying, "The Klan is not dying. The Klan is going ahead by leaps and bounds." I receive at my desk 15 different Klan papers. They are organizing chapters in every hamlet and town. They have set 1935 as the year when they shall take government. Prescribing the need to dismantle the KKK psychologically, Parker finished his speech by calling for Black people to learn about themselves and to rid himself of the inferiority complex which he suffers. He also called upon African Americans to rally together and struggle against white supremacy and the KKK. Throughout his life, Parker wrestled with mental health in a variety of ways. In 1905, he committed to the Nebraska State Hospital for the Insane in Lincoln when he came back to Omaha from Howard University. The basis of that event was detailed in a March 12, 1905 feature in the Omaha World Herald called Remarkable Story of Brilliant Young Negro Author. In 1911, Parker was arrested for murdering a woman in St. Paul, Minnesota. While he was staying there with a fiancée named Marguerite Detienne, she postponed their wedding indefinitely, telling Parker that the woman who ran the boarding house where she lived encouraged her to call off the wedding. Parker went on a rampage and kicked everyone out of the house. He wildly attacked Marguerite's house mother, cutting her more than 40 times until she was dead. Soon after the killing, Parker was sentenced to an insane asylum in Minnesota. However, his father Abraham and the family's minister, Reverend John Albert Williams, took the train to Minnesota and were able to bring Parker back to Omaha. He published nothing between 1911 and 1916, and that year his writing publishing started appearing again. After 1925, there is no record of Parker speaking or writing again. George Wells Parker died in 1931 at age 49. His sister went to Chicago to escort her brother's body back to Omaha, where Reverend Williams led the funeral. Parker was buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in an unmarked grave. Parker was an important voice for Black pride, self-determination, and he was the founder of the Hamitic League of the World, a leader of the Omaha Philosophical Society, writer for The Monitor, editor of the Omaha Whip, and author of Children of the Sun. In 2021, a group of history activists bought a grave marker for Wells' burial site at Forest Lawn Cemetery. We hope you have enjoyed this webisode and have learned about a quite unknown activist who thankfully was recently acknowledged by other community activists. With the push to reduce so-called Black history into sub-Saharan Africa, the Archive of Nations continues to fulfill the great work started by men and women from all races who have a desire for the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Join us on the next episode as we continue to unravel the mysteries of our past to create a better blueprint for the future for all fallen humanity. This series, The Claim of Thrones, will take you on a journey through the universe, across the galactic heavens to the eventual seeding of the planet Earth. This series will also cover the hidden realities of how humanity came about, the various cataclysms and restarts, and follow the various bloodlines of indigenous rights of inheritance. This narrative sets the sacred record straight in regards to who's who on the planet Earth and begins the journey of the lawful reversion and restitution for the heirs of Mother Earth. If you like this content, please subscribe and hit the notification button, as well as support across our many social media platforms.